ensure that everyone's names are visible for attendance purposes. If yours is not, we just want to help you here to tell you to click on whatever's listed at the bottom left of your Zoom picture. A menu will then appear, and then you scroll down that menu until you get to rename. And once you click on rename, it will allow you to type your name, and then it will be visible to everyone during the meeting. And our provisional Kathy Logier will be here, and she is going to take attendance, so that will really help her today. So,
Yeah, I do not see that.
okay. Do you have 3 little buttons on your Zoom screen?
Your name is on there, Betsy.
Yeah, Betsy, it doesn't matter. You're
That's
there.
okay,
Yeah,
Betsy.
you're all set, Betsy.
Thanks, sorry.
Okay, no worries.
Betsy
Okay.
gets 2 points for attending. Yay.
Hi, Judy Rodriguez.
Oh,
Okay, let's start recording. Here we are. Welcome everyone to the January 12th Garden Club membership meeting. And welcome and Happy New Year. Next slide, please. Thank you. We welcome Kathy Logier as our second-year provisional. Kathy's currently serving on photography, conservation, pleasure through plants. And the fun fact is Kathy moved to New York in the 80s to take a job in the fashion industry. She loves art, design, and architecture and has a degree in interior design. And besides having Kathy here as a guest, we'd also like to welcome other Garden Club of Darien guests this evening. And if you are a guest, please wave your hand so everyone can see, and you can even say hello. So your picture jumps up for a brief second. Any guests willing to make a noise? If not, that's okay. All right, next slide, please. Many thanks to Irene Miltmore, who I know is on tonight, for initiating our first Brent and Becky's Blooming Bucks fundraiser. And we just want to remind you, as you start thinking of spring bulbs and planting your gardens, consider ordering from Brent and Becky's, as this is a fundraiser that continues throughout the year. And then when you're ordering, just be sure you designate GCD by clicking on the select organization box. And in that, that's the area you'll put in GCD. All right, thank you. Next slide. We would like to call upon Susie Brewer to share some great news.
So I'm here to report on the gift card contributions that everybody made for Christmas. So this year we gave, I think it's an all-time high, $2,640. And the letter from the Town of Darien Social Services thing, it's just, she said that this was the most challenging year they've ever had. And our gift cards really helped just feed people. So it's a wonderful thing. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Susie. Next up, Tracy with GCA happenings.
Thanks, Betsy. The GCA sent us all an e-blast on January 4th about the great offerings available for this month. Here are some of the highlights. We hope you will have a chance to spend a little time enjoying the following. The #1 trick for becoming a better floral designer, although I'm not sure if that many people in our club need that. Starting a hort diary. Conservation, all soap is not created equally. I read this article. It's an excellent read, not just for what we're constantly putting on our skin these days, but for continued environmental considerations. And it's a fast read. It's really terrific. There's also wonderful videos of past GCA scholars in conservation, hort, and garden design. You can also head to New Zealand with a look back at a past GCA adventure, or head up to Manchester, Vermont and view an artist gardener's delight, which is lovely. There's a lot to discover, so please go online and enjoy. Speaking of the GCA, coming up on January 21st is the Photography Virtual Conference. And please note that the registration ends a week from today, Tuesday the 19th. On February 23rd and 24th, the National Affairs and Legislation Conference will be occurring. If you check your inbox, the invitation to register will be arriving in the next couple of weeks. And also please save the dates of May 10th, 11th, and 12th for the virtual annual meeting and flower show. And in honor of the upcoming GCA annual meeting, tonight, Betsy and I are wearing the official scarves from the show to support Zone 2's Around the Green. You'll see them prominently displayed on the GCA website, and we both agree they're lovely, and it's a wonderful way to support the GCA's educational programs and outreach initiatives. Although both scarves are trans-seasonal, mine is more of a spring-summer palette with powdery pastels and fresh, cooler tones.
And mine embodies the warmer, more neutral, earthy tones with pops of vibrant color on it. So it's got pinks and purples, and they're both pretty, and they're both shown on detail on the Around the Green website. And we also guarantee it's not the last you'll see of these scarves. Before beginning our committee reports, we'd just like to let you know that both our photography and the floral design minute will follow Carol Gracie's presentation tonight. So please stay tuned. Okay, let's go to the committee reports. First up, we have horticulture, Patty and Juliet.
Juliet, are you there? I think Juliet's going to talk about her workshop if she's here.
Okay.
I didn't see whether she was on or not. Okay, well, we've got a couple of things going on. We're doing a workshop, recording a workshop, Debbie McLean and I are, on grooming your plants for the PAR competition in February. And then we are in the midst of planning an actual in-person judging of for the PAR competition, as well as the plants that were propagated in Debbie's driveway back last fall. And we're hoping that's going to be at the Mather Homestead Barn. And we're looking for some judges who will actually be there on their own. We're going to set up all the plants, and then, so anyway, hopefully everybody will have house plants to put in the PAR competition. And those of you who grew things for the propagated plants will enter those as well. Juliet, do you want to talk about your workshop?
Can you kind of go to the
Okay, I'm not sure if Juliet's there, but Juliet is filming something about propagating seeds in milk cartons, any sort of container. And she's going to film it, and then we're going to send it out to everybody and put it on the website. So easy to do. She grew lots of milkweed, and she's got lots of other seeds that she can also give out. So there's more to come on that.
Great.
I think that's about it.
All right, thank you, Patty. We appreciate your help on that. All right, let's go to nominating Sandy, Debbie, and Annie. Sandy? No, Sandy was on a little earlier.
Andy was on.
Hi, can you hear me all?
There you are, yes.
I
Please
have
go
the
ahead.
Yes, we are going ahead with nominating. We have started calling people, and we've been very successful so far with people saying yes to their positions, and we'll be reaching out to the rest of you very soon. Just one other thing is that some of the positions will be staying the same for next year. These are positions that didn't have much going on this year due to COVID, so they will stay the same for next year. But we're looking forward to a new slate next year, and hopefully we'll all be happy with our positions, and we'll talk to you all soon.
All right, thank you so much, Sandy. We appreciate your help. All right, next up, let's go to Amy and Betsy, photography.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you all. I miss you. I know you guys mentioned the GCA photography conference, which is going to be amazing. I think there are over 1,000 people that are already registered for it. The deadline to register is the 19th of January. The conference is taking place on the 21st, and they've got some amazing guest speakers, and they're taking us to the Great Plains with one of the GCA's first national photography medalist. It's going to be great. So I hope you guys think about entering. And the other thing is in February, we're having a judged competition. It is entitled There is Hope. It is a manipulated photograph with plant material required. And we will be sending out tutorials on manipulated photography via an e-blast shortly. So we're hoping that everybody will take advantage of the tutorials and think about entering. Manipulated photography is something that I know nothing about, so I'm looking forward to learning. And March, that we have no exhibition and no competition. So anyway, guys, have a great night. Thank you.
Thank
Aim
you.
on to you.
Yep. Hi, everybody. Happy 2021. I hope it's going to be really healthy and happy for all of us. I just wanted to follow up with the manipulated photography competition. On February 2nd, I will be hosting a Zoom meeting for the entire membership. I will share some YouTubes on manipulated photography, which is really cool. And I'll also have an iPhone photography tool module. It will not take longer than about 40 minutes. And I think the most important thing is to share YouTube manipulated techniques and what manipulated photography really means. It means a bunch of things to different people, but we're going to share that with you, and we're excited. And I look forward to sharing the Winter Sky exhibition with you at the end.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy and Betsy. And I know Tracy and I are signed up for the photography virtual conference. So let's make sure everybody else signs up, because it looks like it's going to be an amazing event. Let's go on to Susan and Leslie provisionals. Susan Delp, I know you were on earlier.
She's on.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Yeah, Leslie, I think, is in Europe right now. So I'll report on behalf of the provisionals. All the provisionals did a wonderful job distributing gifts at Betsy Becker's home for the holiday to everyone in the garden club. So thank you to all the girls who did that. And we have some fun pictures I'll put into the next newsletter on that. Let's see, they're doing a lot of clerking duties coming up. They did some in the fall, so they're really being very active and very involved in attending as many of the committee meetings as possible. The next steps on the Mather project are to order the signage for the plantings there. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention was we've gotten a great response from the provisionals because they'd like to participate in the seed workshop that Juliet Kane is doing for the Hort group. And what's great about it is that potentially next year they may do some plantings at Mather regarding natives. So it could be a nice tie-in, an educational piece, and a nice tie-in for anything that they might do there next year. So that's it for the provisionals. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Let's go to programs. Diane, would you please introduce our speaker?
There, I just had to unmute. I wasn't aiming. Carol, thanks so much for your patience. Carol's been with us since before the rest of us just got on, and I know she's pretty new to Zoom. Lisa, thank you for helping, but she certainly isn't new to the field of gardening, especially when it comes to, in tonight's case, wildflowers. So while Carol is brilliant in all types of flowers and plants and photography, a popular lecturer, a very accomplished author, tonight we are talking about spring flowers to hopefully get us all in the mood, looking forward to spring, and in particular spring wildflowers in the Northeast. So this is probably going to be a lot based on the book that she's written, Spring Wildflowers of the Northeast, A Natural History, which has been followed very recently by a book called Summer Wildflowers of the Northeast, A Natural History. I happen to know these books are big and beautiful with hundreds and hundreds of detailed color photos. And as I mentioned, she's a photographer herself. What I found most interesting is that Carol had been for 30 years with the New York Botanical Garden. She was director of the Foreign Tour Program, and she worked extensively with the Children's Education Department. Later worked in the science division, making dozens of trips to South and Central America. And if I put all the information together, I'm guessing you might have met your husband, who's a botanist, during this time. I know you traveled extensively together. You've had 7 newly discovered tropical plant species named by you. It just goes on and on. You've written a book together, I think, with your husband. But as I said, it's spring wildflowers. So bring it on, Carol. Thank you and welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for that very nice introduction.
So Lisa, maybe the PowerPoint, right? Presentation or PowerPoint slides.
Actually, Carol's going to run her own. So Carol, if you want to share your screen now.
Yeah, I did hit share screen.
Okay. The green button.
Right.
Yeah. But it doesn't seem to be doing it.
No, another screen opened in front of it, which just shows.
Yes. There's that screen that you open in front. You should see your screen as one of the options. And if you click that, it will bring it up.
Okay,
Usually it's
well,
the
the options that are given are iPhone, iPad, and whiteboard, and none of those are my program.
Do you see a screen that says desktop 1?
No, I don't. Oh, yes, I do. Okay, that's what you're on.
If you click on that, that would be your screen, and you can share that.
Okay.
We did this earlier, so I know it works.
Oh, it looks good.
There we go.
Oops, we've got your whole desktop.
Right, and then you can just pull up your presentation from there and start the.
There we go.
Right, and you might want to hit that little green button to bring it up to fill your whole screen.
Okay, I think if I hit slideshow, it will do that.
Yeah, it should, yeah.
Okay, so we're off. I'm hoping to give you a chance tonight to get away from the news of the world and to think about the future and spring coming and all of the wildflowers that will bring, and bring a little light and joy into your lives at this dark time of year. You might think that I would begin with what I consider to be our earliest spring wildflower, that is hepatica. And normally I would begin a program about spring wildflowers with hepatica. But this year, since it's still only January, I'm going to start right at the beginning and talk about our first native bloomer, which is skunk cabbage. Now, many of you may not consider skunk cabbage to be a wildflower, but it is a wild native plant. I find it quite exciting to see these coming up in late winter, early spring in the swampy areas near me. And I find them quite interesting to talk about. You'll notice that in this case, this plant is actually flowering right in the middle of the snowy winter. In fact, I took this on February 16th, a number of years ago. So this is a flower that can bloom. I can't truly call it a spring wildflower. It's more like a winter wildflower, but it will continue to bloom, or at least some of them will, up into March. So I encourage you to get out there even before spring really starts and start looking at this plant, because as I say, it's got a very interesting life history. And I find it to be quite beautiful. It's got a sculptural form to it. They look almost like miniature Henry Moore sculptures to me. That sort of rounded, sensual curve to them. And what we're looking at are what are called the spathes, and I'll explain that in just a moment. Here we have 2 plants growing side by side. You can see into the right one. You can see these flowers here. The outer part here is the spathe, as I mentioned. They're usually this sort of dark maroon or magenta in color. And it's really a modified leaf. Inside, protected by that spathe, is a spadix. And on that spadix are all of the flowers. And in the case of skunk cabbage, these flowers are what botanists call perfect flowers. That means that they have both male and female parts. So here I've cut open 3 different spadices, plural of spathe. And you can see inside that one of them looks different, this one over here. And that's because although they are perfect flowers and they have both male and female parts, the one on the upper left in this photograph is still in the female phase. These bloom sequentially female, and then starting at the top of the spadix, move down and become male. So the one on the left is still in the female phase. The 2 on the right are in the male phase and producing their pollen. Here's a closer look. On the left, we have the female. Each one of these little white spots that you see is just a simple stigma. These are very, very simple flowers, nothing showy, because generally there aren't too many pollinators out at this time of year to attract, so they don't have to be flashy. The one on the right is in the male phase, and that has 4 little stamens comprising each flower. So you can see there's a real difference between them. But these on the right, the males, started off looking like this. And over time, they withered up the female stigma and produced the male stamens. Notice down at the bottom here, the pollen has been falling off of these stamens and has collected in the spathe. So that means that on a mild winter day, there are things that are out flying, especially flies. Flies are able to fly at quite low temperatures, but even occasional honeybees will be out. And they're attracted to these spathes because they are sort of warming refuges for these insects that have to warm their flight muscles periodically to keep searching for pollen or nectar. It's interesting that the spadix, the part that the flowers are on, is actually able to generate its own heat to the extent that it can be 77 degrees warmer. They've tested this by sticking a thermometer into the spadix, warmer than the ambient air temperature. So some people say, well, the skunk cabbage melts its way through the snow, which is not really true, but it is warm in there. And because it has that dark spathe enclosing it, which is very thick and almost like styrofoam, so it holds that heat inside. It tends to melt the surrounding snow, as you saw in that picture I showed you with the snowy scene and the flowers blooming in February. You can see the male flowers have formed up top here, but those at the bottom are still female. So it's working its way down. These were all female. Now they've become male, and these eventually will become male as well. I think one of the wonderful sights in spring is seeing this lush green color that lines streams and fills the swamps from the skunk cabbage leaves, which develop after these spathe and spadices have begun to wither. These leaves can reach a size of 2 to 3 feet in length, so really quite big. And although it has the name skunk cabbage, it's not like you would walk by and smell a skunky smell. It's only if you step on it and crush it that the oils that release that sort of unpleasant aroma are given off. If you visit early in the season when there are no leaves and when it's just the inflorescence or spathe and spadix, and you very delicately bend down and put your nose in there, you'll smell an actual sort of sweet smell given off by the flowers. So that's, along with the warmth, what attracts the few flying insects. Now, I like to show every part of my plants. And I had read that the roots of skunk cabbage are really tenacious. And I learned that as a fact by trying to dig up a small one that was down near our lake, and found it impossible with my little trowel. So I convinced my husband, using the old Tom Sawyer ploy, that it would be fun to go out and dig up a big one and see what they look like. And a foolish friend said, well, I'll go with you. And here's my husband at work, digging up one of these plants. This was early April. Notice he's in a t-shirt. It was an amazingly warm day that day. And they did what they thought was a good job. They really tried hard, but they didn't realize how widespread those roots were. So when they finally got the plant detached from the ground, a lot of the roots were cut. And I said, that will never do for a photograph in my book. So they started over again, this time digging a big hole, as you can see. And eventually it took them 3 hours to finally get the specimen I needed to photograph. And here it is. Each one of these roots is probably 12 to 15, maybe even in some cases 18 inches long. You can see how many they are, and they're not only deep, but they're spread widely. So this is what I wanted to show people. They washed it off nicely for me. And aside from having these long, strong roots, each root is interesting in that, whoops, let me go back a moment. Sorry. Okay, that's not going to work because I don't have my arrows visible on here. But each root is what's called a contractile root. And a contractile root is one that grows a little bit and then shrinks a little bit, then grows again and shrinks again. And thus it pulls itself more deeply into that soft, wet soil where it's growing. And that makes it extra hard to dig out. At the base of the plant where the spadix once was, that is now developing into a fruit. And I just passed by one that I had cut open to show the seeds developing inside. But remember, these fruits only develop if these plants are pollinated. And they can only be pollinated by pollen from another plant. They are now self-compatible. So that pollen from the top flowers cannot fall down onto the stigmas of the bottom flowers and cause pollination to occur. It has to be brought by an insect from another plant. So very few of these form fruits. And when they do, it's usually at the time of year that the leaves are beginning to deliquesce and sort of just disappear. And the fruits are by that time dark brown, and they just sort of blend in with the dark, wet soil. So they're very difficult to find, even if they are there. But I'm going to move along to what we consider a real wildflower now. And in this case, this is Dutchman's breeches, which often grows on rocky hillsides, as you see here. Sometimes along trails that are not quite as rocky, but this is how I most often find on slopes and in rocky areas. And Dutchman's breeches gets its common name, Dutchman's breeches, from the fact that each flower looks like a little pair of Dutchman's old-fashioned pantaloons. Even the scientific name, dicentra, comes from the Latin for two horns. And these flowers look as though they have two horns. Here you can see growing along this pink stipe, several little pairs of Dutchman's pantaloons hanging out to dry. And sometimes even the flowers themselves are pink. Not too often in the East, but in the Midwest, this is more common. I found them a couple of times in Westchester County. Woods is one place where I found them. So it's kind of fun to find them in a different color. Let's take a closer look at the flowers. I mentioned the fact that they have two horns, which are called the spur petals, 1 and 2. And it's in the very tip of these spur petals that the nectar is held. So when you picture an insect trying to get that nectar, and this is the opening down here where the spur petals flare out, you realize that insect has to have a long proboscis or tongue to reach up there. And not too many insects are co-evolved with a plant, with a flower like this to be able to do that. So this is a member of the poppy family, and poppy family plants, flowers, generally have 4 petals. In this case, there are 2 spur petals and 2 inner petals that are enclosed initially before these spurs open up by the spur petals. Within these inner petals are the reproductive parts. So here you have a bee's eye view of the flowers. These flowers don't produce any aroma. So it's really the contrasting yellow and white color that attracts the insects to them, and especially against a brilliant blue spring sky like this. These bloom in generally early April, very early April. And flying in early April are the queen bees, bumblebees that have overwintered all winter long under logs, under peeling bark, under leaves. And they are the only members of their previous year's cohort to have survived the winter. All of the rest of them died after a mating ritual that occurred in late summer, early fall. So it's up to the queen to found a new colony. In order to do so, when she emerges from her winter hibernation point, she comes out and she's flying low over the ground. First of all, looking for a hole in the ground, usually an old mouse burrow or something like that, in which to make her nest. And then she's also looking for early blooming flowers from which she can get a source of nectar for her own energy requirements and the pollen she needs to feed her young. So here she doesn't have any pollen in her pollen baskets here, but she has a lot of pollen dusted on her that she will then broom off and move back to the pollen baskets. She'll bring this back to the nest, make balls of it, and lay an egg on each one. And those larvae that hatch out will feed on the pollen and then pupate and emerge as adults and become one of the worker bees. So from just these queens, if you see a bumblebee flying in early spring, you'll know that it's a queen bumblebee. They're usually larger than most bumblebees, but that goes according to species. So some species are much larger than others. She has her proboscis inserted in here all the way up into the tip of one of these spurs to get nectar. But sometimes these queen bees are impatient, or there are certain species of bumblebees, for instance, Bombus affinis, that don't have a tongue long enough to reach up into this spur. So they savagely rip apart the flower with their mandibles and rip off a part of it, which allows other smaller bees, like this single solitary bee, to reach the nectar with their shorter proboscises. So in a way, it's good for other bees, but it destroys the flower in the process. Here you can see where another bee has drilled a little hole directly into the nectar, and therefore bypassing the reproductive parts and not playing its role in the pollination of the flowers. All of this has co-evolved so that there's a right way to be a legitimate pollinator and a way to be what we call a pollen robber. Another very closely related species is squirrel corn. It's in the same genus as Dutchman's breeches, but rather than having the long pantaloons, it has sort of a heart-shaped top where its nectar is kept. Here you can see a bumblebee doing the proper thing. These little brown marks that you see are where the bee was gripping the flower with its sharp little claws, and it puts its proboscis all the way up into these spurs to get the nectar. In the case of that one, let me see if I can go back here. I found the arrow down here. In the case of this one, some bee, or maybe a wasp, there are some early flying wasps, has ripped open the nectary itself and just taken the nectar without passing the reproductive parts and causing pollination. There is another potential pollinator, and that is the bee fly. Now, you might mistake this for a bee because it's got a fuzzy body, it's got a long tongue, but it's actually a member of the fly family, called a bee fly, and it can reach up into that spur to get the nectar, but it also has very long legs, which hold it well away from where the pollen might fall out on its body. So it's not often a very effective pollinator. Squirrel corn gets its name from the fact that its underground bulblets look like little kernels of corn. And you can often see these in the early spring, especially after a heavy rain when erosion causes the soil to wash away. These are very, very shallowly located in the soil. They're really just under the surface level. So you'll often see these exposed, and sometimes if they've been exposed long enough, they tend to turn reddish. Whereas on Dutchman's breeches, the bulblets are probably 5 to 6 inches deep, and they're just small little white fleshy things like this, so you don't often see those. The leaves look very similar on the squirrel corn and the Dutchman's breeches, and I'm sometimes hard pressed myself when they're not in flower to tell them apart. In this case, I was lucky enough to find them growing side by side. Often I find that the squirrel corn grows at a little bit lower elevation and the Dutchman's breeches a little bit higher if I'm on a slope. But here you can see the difference in the leaves. The Dutchman's breeches on the left are not as finely dissected as the squirrel corn leaves on the right. And I think the squirrel corn leaves are often a little bit bluer green. Now this is a true spring ephemeral. The spring ephemeral is one that's evolved over eons to grow in our northeastern forests, which at one time covered the entire eastern part of the country. And they leaf out usually in early May. So early spring ephemerals have to use the time before they leaf out to gather sunlight with their leaves, which are little solar collectors, and make photosynthate, or starch is how they store it, in their underground bulblets for next year's growth. They also produce their flowers and fruits very quickly. The entire lifespan of Dutchman's breeches above ground may only be maybe a month. And then they will wither down and die to the ground, and you won't see them again until next year. But underground, those bulblets have stored that starchy material made by the leaves and will be able to grow early in the next year. These are the fruits. They look like little pea pods. And they form as the leaves are beginning to senesce. They turn yellow and gradually just disappear. And I've looked under these plants numerous times looking for the seeds, which are only a couple of millimeters big, so they're not easy to find, and they're black. So I've taken a pod that wasn't quite ready to open yet and split it open to show you the seeds. The seeds are these very hard, dark black structures. But notice that each one of them has a little white fleshy structure attached to it. This is something called an elaiosome. And a lyosome is something that's rich in lipids, very nutritional. And in fact, the name comes from the Greek for oil body. And these are relished by ants, which are out looking for a food source in early spring. And here, talking about photography, which I'll do at the end of this program, I was so glad that nobody was around when I was trying to get this photograph, because I crawled on my hands and knees after ant to try and catch one. They move very fast. Catch one carrying the seed away. What they do is take the seeds back to their nest. They don't eat the elaiosome on the spot, but they take it back to their nest and then eat the elaiosome and leave the seed in their midden pile, which is often a nutrient-rich source for it to grow. So thus the plant gets its seed away from the mother colony, which is a good thing, because if something happens to that colony, it has generations to come in another colony. The seed and the elaiosome. This is a strategy employed by many of our spring flowering plants, and it's a way of getting their seeds dispersed over a greater area. Sanguinaria canadensis, or bloodroot, comes up very soon after this. It's another early April plant, but a little bit later than squirrel corn or Dutchman's breeches. You can see the tip of the flower poking through here, but it's completely enshrouded by its leaf. The leaf is very thin and membranous at this point, but it very quickly opens up, becomes a deep green, still surrounding the flower. This has a very weak stem. And notice that the flowers are closed in this picture. With many of our spring ephemerals blooming at a time of the year when there's a lot of rain and insects are prone not to fly during the rain, they protect their pollen by closing the flowers on rainy days and also at night. But let the sun come out and the flowers open up. Again, they're a member of the poppy family. And this doesn't have 4 petals. It has a multiple of 4, which is often true. It has 8 petals, which is typical for for Sanguinaria canadensis, or bloodroot. And it exposes its anthers and other reproductive parts, the pistil, at that point, when it's a sunny day and insects are likely to be flying. It's interesting to see them just as they open. You can see that they sort of alternate in their petals from wide to narrow, and gradually that difference disappears as the flower opens a little bit further. But it's thought that 4 of these stamens transformed into petals, which often happens. That's why we have roses with many, many petals. A typical rose would have only 5 petals, a native rose. But many times they've been manipulated by horticulturists to have their stamens transformed into petals. And that's what's happened in nature here. So that rather than 4, we have 8 petals now. Their main pollinators, again, are small native bees. These are solitary bees. They don't live in a colony like a bumblebee. You can see that this one has collected a lot of pollen, which it has packed into its pollen baskets here. This is sort of a hard mass of pollen, and it's not available for pollination purposes. It's to be brought back to the nest. But all of this loose pollen on the bee's face can be brushed off against the female stigma and allow the plant to become pollinated. So some of these bloodroots can be found with even more than 8 petals. And these are sold often in garden centers. They're known as Sanguinaria canadensis plena, meaning full. They may have 10 or even up to 20 petals. Many gardeners prefer these because they're a little bit showier. Notice the leaf still maintains its position around that delicate stem. And then to take it to the extreme, there's what's called Sanguinaria canadensis multiplex. This again is sold in garden centers. I've seen a plant sold for up to $50 per plant. So they're quite expensive because they are very rare. They have had all of their reproductive parts transformed into petals, and thus they can no longer reproduce sexually. They have to be asexually reproduced by taking a piece of the rhizome and growing a new plant from that. This was discovered back in the early 1900s by a farmer out in Ohio who noticed a different plant in his woodland, and he realized it was special, and he sent pieces of the rhizome to friends of his that he knew would be interested, some of whom worked at botanical gardens. And then when somebody wanted to grow this plant and went back to the original site, the farmer had died by that time. His wife went out where she knew it was, and it was gone. But fortunately, a number of years later, it turned up in the Montreal Botanical Garden, which sent cuttings of the rhizome to other botanical gardens. And it's from that that we have most of our multiplex bloodroot today. Now, I do have a friend who lives in Stamford, Connecticut, who had the typical bloodroot growing in her garden. And then one day she went out and she had these growing. So I don't know what causes that mutation, but it can happen abruptly. It's just some genetic mutation that will cause this to happen. It's not that somebody has manipulated the plant as they do with roses and many other flowers in horticulture. So that's very popular with gardeners because it can't be pollinated, in which case it loses its petals almost immediately. It lasts for a much longer period of time. It may bloom for weeks, whereas the native bloodroot, the typical 8-petaled one, may be there just for a few days. I've in fact missed it in my own garden by not going out and checking every day. One of the things I like about bloodroot is that rather than being a true spring ephemeral, its leaves last throughout the entire summer season, growing larger and larger throughout the summer until they reach a diameter of perhaps 8 inches or so. And they can form a very nice ground cover if you've got a shady area that needs something interesting. I find the leaves to be very interesting in shape, each one a little bit differently lobed. So think about that if you're looking for something to grow in the shade. Another one is wild ginger, which I'm not talking about today, but that's an even lower plant that will last throughout the summer. Flowers are not very showy. You have to go looking under the leaves to see them, but they're interesting. So wild ginger and bloodroot are two that keep their leaves throughout the summer and provide a nice ground cover in shady or wooded areas. The fruit of bloodroot is usually hidden by these large leaves. Here I opened one that was not yet ripe, so you can see the seeds forming. These immature white seeds have what you now know is an elaiosome attached. So this is true of Dutchman's breeches, of squirrel corn, of bloodroot, of trillium, of celandine poppy, and many others of our spring flora. Here I was able to catch one just as it opened in my garden before it spilled its seeds. And you can see that they turn this sort of nice tan color. And the elaiosome is here to attract ants. It does so by giving off an aroma, what's called a pheromone, and the ants are attracted to that. But after a few days, that pheromone dissipates. So if the ants don't collect the seeds within the first few days, they often lie where they fall. And I had read that in many cases, if the ant doesn't remove the elaiosome, the seed won't germinate. But I've found from my own gardening experience that they do indeed germinate, and I've had many young plants growing under my old bloodroot plants. Bloodroot, of course, gets its name from the fact that it has a colored sap, and in this case, colored red or red-orange, just like a blood color. You don't need to dig the plant up. It's called bloodroot, which is not exactly a good name. I'll show you why in a moment. But you don't need to dig it up to see that red sap. You can just nick the vein of a leaf and see it come out like this. But if you dig up the plant, which is a good way to propagate it in the late summer, you can dig up a portion of your bloodroot, take a cutting maybe a few inches long from this is a rhizome, although it's called a root. It's much like an iris, it's an underground stem. These are the roots coming down from it, which of course also have red sap in. But it's this rhizome that was cherished by the Native Americans and collected and actually dried and stored for when they needed a red dye for either dyeing their bodies or their clothing or their basketry work or for medicinal purposes. So you can see that rhizome continues to grow, sending off new shoots at its apex as it grows. So it was only back in the 1990s that they found another use for this plant, a medicinal use. The Indians used it often for treating sore throats or other things. But the compound that was found in this plant that had some use medicinally in the 90s is called sanguinarine. And it's an alkaloid. Alkaloids are often toxic. And this was used as a plaque inhibitor. And it was put into toothpaste and mouthwash. And the ads, full page ads at that time were in magazines showing that it was from a native wildflower, sort of implying that, well, it must be safe if it's from nature. But of course, that's not always true. And sure enough, after people had been using for a number of years, they discovered that those people who used it on a daily basis were 10 times, almost 10 times more likely to develop white lesions on the inside of their mouths, which could become precancerous. So it was very quickly taken off the market. So nature is a source of many of our important medicines, but you have to know what you're doing, and it has to be rigorously tested before you actually decide to put it into your mouth or use it in other ways. Trout lily is another early spring favorite. It blooms in trout season and the leaves are sort of mottled like many trout. So that's how it got its name. It often grows in very large colonies. It is, again, a true spring ephemeral, and it leaves its flowers closed on rainy or overcast days when insects are not likely to be flying about, as you can see here. But on a sunny day, these tepals reflex very strongly backwards, so it looks almost like a miniature Turk's cap lily. These are the days, the sunny days, that insects are out and flying. And we'll visit this plant to get mostly pollen. I think they also collect nectar. But you can see that only 3 of these anthers have dehisced or open. And they expose their pollen in this way so that if it's a rainy spring and they've opened 3 of their anthers and no insects have come, well, they'll have another chance maybe a week or so later when they open the other 3 anthers. So I want you to notice that these 3 still intact anthers here are sort of a dull reddish color, whereas in this picture, the anthers are yellow. These are the same species, and there's actually a study going on now to determine whether eventually, over evolutionary time, one of these will take over and replace the other one, whether one is more successful in attracting pollinators. But the study began back in 1910 or 1911. It takes a good 7 years to grow an erythronium from seed that can produce a flower. So theoretically, that could have happened by now, but I think they don't have enough data to know whether more of these offspring have yellow or red anthers. I searched just today to see if there's a paper by the authors working on this, and there is no paper published yet. The insects that you see on this plant are not ones that you want to encourage. They're not pollinators. Instead, they're pollen consumers, and they will feed on the pollen of these anthers, often turning them black. So if you see black anthers, it means these redneck beetles have been on your plants eating the pollen. I did refer to these flower parts as tepals earlier on. Many members, well, all members of the lily family and members of other monocot families often have petals and sepals that look almost identical. So in this case, the three inner ones, if you were looking into the face of the flower, are the petals, and the three outer ones, which in this case from the back have a darker marking on, but they look the same from the front, are actually sepals. And botanists like their terminology, so they've given this the name tepals. And again, the native pollinators are these small andrenid bees, which are very active in early spring. They're very interesting bees. You can see this one is collecting pollen. It's got its corbiculae or pollen baskets full, but it's also getting dusted with pollen and brushing its body up against the stigma here so that it can cause pollination. Here's a closer look at that. So this pollen that's packed into its pollen baskets is what it's going to take back to its nest. Again, it's the queen bee, and these are the nests. These are not bees that live in a colonial way like a bumblebee, for instance. They live each one in a separate nest, but they locate these nests close to each other, often on a sandy slope or someplace like this at the edge of a forest where it's kind of grassy and there's some soil exposed. So each one of these is the exclusive domain of one queen andrenid bee. And you can verify this. You can verify that they're not anthills by just sitting there and watching for a while and seeing the bees coming in with pollen and leaving without the pollen. If you were to cut one of these in cross section through the soil, they go down about a foot deep, and they have these little side tunnels going off on both sides in which they put a ball of pollen and again lay an egg like the queen bumblebee that will feed on the pollen. But in this case, the larva that results pupates within that tunnel and does not emerge until the next spring. It spends all winter in this nest. Here you can see one coming out. It took a long time for me to get this shot because I had to sit there very quietly, being careful not to put a shadow over. They're very skittish. If they see your shadow, they won't come out. But this one had dropped off its pollen earlier and was going out to forage for more. This little white structure here, you'll often find in a bed of erythronium or trout lily. And it's part of the trout lily. Underground, it sends off stolons. And these are called droppers when they sometimes hit up against a hard surface like a rock or maybe some hard soil. And they're forced to come up above ground. But their goal is to find a good place to develop another corm at the tip of this stolon. So they always reverse their path and go back into the ground and continue searching for an ideal spot to grow into a new plant, which will take a long period, several years. So I wondered about these for years and years until I finally figured out the explanation. Now, this is one of my favorite flowers. And if you look at it, you can see why. It's one of the most delicate flowers. I wonder how many of you recognize this. It looks almost like a a 5-petaled snowflake. And I wish that it were maybe 3 or 4 inches across instead of 3 or 4 millimeters across. But this is a plant called mitrewort or Mitella diphylla, or sometimes known as bishop's cap. And the flowers, as I mentioned, are extremely small. They grow on a stalk like this. They're noticeable if they grow in large quantities like this, but they're always in very dark forest in wetland areas. So they're often, especially if there aren't many of them, they're often bypassed. And it's only if you get down on your hands and knees with a hand lens that you can really appreciate the beauty of the flower. They're pollinated by very small flies. So here you can see the 2 leaves that arise opposite each other on the stem just below where the flowers start. That name Mitella means bishop's mitre, meaning the shape of a bishop's hat. And that comes from the shape of the fruit of this plant, and diphylla meaning 2 leaves. These bloom from the bottom up along the stalk. So these are still in bud. And if the stalk is bent over for some reason, sometimes it just becomes top heavy on its own and bends over. The fruit that develops from the ovary of this flower will always right itself so that its seam, the part that will open up, is facing upwards. And the reason for that is that it has a very unusual means of dispersal. These are the seeds located in these cupped fruits that split along the top seam. And what happens is raindrops act as dispersal agents. The raindrops fall into these cups, and depending on the size of the raindrop and the velocity of its fall, it can disperse these seeds anywhere from just under the plant to up to 1 meter away. So it's an unusual method of dispersal, but it's found also in some other plants like veronicas or speedwells. It's found in some liverworts, and it's found in some fungi like the bird's nest fungus. Now this is kind of a homely looking plant at this stage. It's got these sort of wrinkled up blue-gray, greenish leaves surrounding what look like flower buds. They are flower buds. But this becomes quite a lovely plant. It's blue cohosh that opens up those ugly wrinkled up purple leaves into beautiful 3-lobed green leaves like this. This plant grows to be about 1 foot tall, so it's another plant that can form a ground cover. It grows in forest areas, so it's a good plant for shaded parts of your garden. It's taller, so it could be behind your bloodroot or your ginger if you want some variety in your ground covers. And most people grow it either for its leaves, not so much for its flowers, which are very small, but very interesting. If you look carefully at the flowers, what look like petals, these sort of purple structures, they can be yellow or purple or greenish, are actually the sepals of the flower. And what look to be these glistening little semicircular structures here are the petals that have evolved into nectaries. So this is nectar that you see glistening here. And purplish flowers are often very attractive to flies. Here we have a closer look showing the sepal, the petal, which is modified into a nectary, the stamens, and the pistil with stigma at its tip. As flies visit these flowers, they touch all of those reproductive parts in the center as they're gathering nectar, and they fly off to another flower and bring some of that pollen with them. Yet many types of flies visiting the blue cohosh flowers. That previous large hairy one was a tachinid fly. This is a typical little flower fly or hoverfly that we can see on our flowers all spring and all summer long. They're often mistaken for small bees because of their striped bodies, but if you look at the large eyes and the very short antennae, that gives you a clue that it's a fly and not a bee. Blue cohosh is often grown for what people refer to as their beautiful blue fruits. These look sort of like blueberries in terms of their color and their size. But in fact, I have to put fruits in quotation marks because they are not fruits. What they are is the seeds of the plants. What happened is that very early on, as the seeds were developing, they grow very quickly, they grow very large, and they burst right through the fruit wall. So the fruit wall just shrivels up and disappears, and you're left with these developing seeds, which initially are this pale whitish green color. And as they mature, they become this blue, which is happening in the fall. Here I've taken one of those seeds and scraped off the outer seed coat with my fingernail, so you can see it's just this papery thin substance. It's nothing fleshy that really would be a good thing to eat. However, birds are deceived. They see these blue fruits, they think that they're nice, juicy berries. It's migration season. They need lots of food energy to get them further south. So they never seem to learn, and they pluck these off and travel on south, where they excrete the seeds, often at great distance. So this is an indication that it can have long distance dispersal. But these seeds go through many colors, from that greenish white to sometimes a pink, to an aqua blue, to eventually the deep blue, which is happening throughout the season, because migration isn't all in one wave, it's in different waves of different species of birds. So they always need some of these fruits to be in the stage that will attract birds as they're going through. But it's at the time that the leaves are senescing, so you've had them, this is probably taken in late September, early October. You've had these leaves growing all summer long. Here's another one that forms a ground cover. This is May apple, named because it flowers in May. The apple or fruit does not form in May, but it comes up out of the ground looking like a furled umbrella. They're really kind of fun to watch unfurl, as this one is beginning to do on the right. This is a member of the barberry family, surprisingly enough, since we all hate the introduced barberry that covers our woodland understory. But it's a native plant. All of the plants I'm talking about are native. And I like to focus on natives and introduce them to our gardens because they've co-evolved with the pollinators from this area, and they provide food for the native pollinators. You'll see you'll see mayapple with either a single leaf, in which case it's attached at the center of the leaf to its leaf stalk, or you'll see plants with two leaves. And in that case, the leaf stalk is attached more toward the edge of the leaf. And the reason for this is that as these plants are developing underground, they're also, if they're two-leaved plants, mature enough to have enough food energy stored in their underground rhizomes to form flowers. You must have two leaves to form a flower. And these plants are making room by moving their leaves over toward the side, because the flower will form right in the midst of where those two leaves join. You can see the leaf stalk coming off from each of these, right at the edge of the leaf, and the flower has developed right in the middle here. The flowers are really quite beautiful, but they often go unnoticed because they are under those very large leaves. They're unnoticed not only by people, so if you plant them, you may want to plant them kind of up on a ledge, or maybe on the top of a stone wall or someplace like that. Should be in the shade though. But they're quite pretty flowers. They have numerous petals, numerous stamens, numerous stigmas, and a large ovary, which you can see here where some of the stamens have fallen off, that will continue to develop into a 2-inch diameter fruit. And these fruits, I had read, are dispersed by box turtles. And I said, well, how can that be? This is about 8-10 inches off the ground. How does the box turtle reach that? I couldn't imagine a box turtle standing on its hind legs to get this fruit. But after going out a number of times in the fall, I found that those fruits get heavy enough to pull the plant right over onto the ground, where the turtles have easy pickings. And here's the box turtle that eats the seed, the entire fruit, passes those seeds through its digestive system. And although turtles are considered slow, they do move quite a long distance before excreting those seeds, maybe up to 2 football fields, 200 meters or so, before the seeds are excreted. So you can get more May apples, which has happened in my own yard. I had some growing down by the lake, and a few years later, I had some growing 30 yards up from the lake. And I never did find the box turtle who did it, but I can only assume that that's how they got there. And now they're even further up in another area. Now you may wonder what in the world Lance Armstrong is doing in the midst of my wildflower talk. But Podophyllum mayapple is a very poisonous plant. And although box turtles eat the fruits, every part of that plant is poisonous, from the stem to the leaves to the fruits, when the fruits are immature. But when the fruits are ripe, they are not poisonous. However, many plants that have toxic properties are also of use medicinally. And there's a Himalayan relative of our common mayapple, which is the only member of the genus in North America. The other 13 or 14 species are all Asian. And there's a Himalayan species from which was derived, podophyllitoxin, which is a chemical that was made into a drug called etoposide. And in testing etoposide against various cell lines of cancer, they found it effective against small cell lung cancer, against testicular cancer, which is what Lance Armstrong suffered from, and other types of cancer as well. But in order to harvest these plants, they had to dig them up and take the rhizomes. So this plant was becoming endangered to the point that it was going to go extinct in its native habitat. So they started looking at all of the other species of this plant, and they found that even our native mayapple has podophyllitoxin to a fairly high degree in the leaves. So there's talk now of growing this in cultivation and harvesting the leaves after they've had enough time to allow photosynthesis to store food in the rhizome, and harvesting just the leaves so that the rhizome can stay there to produce additional plants in the future. So Lance Armstrong is here because he's one of the survivors of cancer due to the drug found in mayapple, or a relative of mayapple in this case. So now that you have heard my talk about skunk cabbage, you will recognize something similar in this plant that everybody knows as Jack in the Pulpit, in that it's comprised of a spathe and a spadix, or in this case, I'm pointing to the appendix on the spadix. The spadix itself is down in the base of the spathe here. So you might guess that it's in the same family, the Araceae or the aroid family, and that would be correct. This is the only family that has this type of inflorescence. So now you can impress your friends wherever you travel and know what plant family you're looking at if it has a spathe and spadix. And I've been fortunate to travel to various parts of the world. In this case, I was in a mountainous area of Crete, where we came across several plants of this dragon arum called Dracunculus, which has a very, very deep red spathe and spadix. This is a very large plant. It's probably close to 3 feet tall. with the spathe and spadix being over a foot. So it's quite noticeable. Sometimes that red is so dark that it appears black. I'll show you a closer view of this, which is something that horticulturists have often tried for in terms of getting black tulips or black flowers of any sort, just because it's so unusual. And it makes it look sort of evil to me. And we walked by this plant as we were hiking down a mountainous trail in the morning and stopped to take pictures of it. Coming back up that same trail in the afternoon, we began smelling that distinctive smell of a deer that's been dead on the roadside for a few days. And that's the aroma that this plant gives off in the afternoon. And there is, of course, a purpose. It's trying to attract carrion beetles or carrion flies to think that this is rotting meat in which they can lay their eggs. And in doing so, they brush against the pollen and the stigmas and cause pollination to be occurring. Now, this is a plant of the Amazon waterways. It's a small plant, maybe 6-7 inches across. It's an aquatic plant. If you pull one of these up and look in the midst of these leaves and find one in flower, you'll see that it too has a spathe and spadix, but it's only about 1/4 of an inch tall. So it's the structure of the flower that really classifies plants into families. So here we have skunk cabbage, jack in the pulpit, dragon arum, and water lettuce, all in the same family, all with the same spathe and spadix arrangement, but all looking quite different from each other in terms of their vegetative parts and the size of their inflorescence. But let's go back to our own native jack in the pulpit, which you may find with green and white stripes or purple and white stripes. They're both the same species. A very young plant will just produce a single leaf. There will be no inflorescence. It hasn't had the time to store energy in its underground corm to allow it to produce an inflorescence. A plant with a larger single leaf can produce an inflorescence. Depending on how large this leaf is, it may be a male or it may be a female. Because unlike skunk cabbage, jack in the pulpit is a dioecious plant. It has its male flowers on one plant and its female flowers on another plant. It does not have perfect flowers. But you can get a clue if you look carefully at the spathe, at the bottom of the spathe. There's often a clue in that in a male plant, there'll be a little opening. And this is because these plants are attractive to pollinators that are searching for a fungus. And they lay their eggs on the fungus so that their larvae and the adults as well can feed on the fungus. And it's said that this plant gives off a fungus-like aroma. Now, I have a pretty good nose for things like this, and I have not been able to detect that, but evidently the fungus gnats do. They go down, they look for a place to lay their eggs, and they realize, uh-oh, I've made a mistake. They try to climb out, but the walls are slippery. They're not able to fly up the way a helicopter could. They can't fly straight up. So they're really trapped in there, bumbling around, meanwhile getting dusted with pollen from the stamens in that male inflorescence, until they finally see this little light down at the bottom and realize, hey, I can escape. And they get out and they fly off to another jack in the pulpit. Remember, these are not very bright insects. A fungus gnat has a very small brain. So they try it again. Here's the male inflorescence. This is where they were. These are very simple flowers on not a ball-like spadix in this case, but a columnar spadix, just comprised of 4 little stamens each. Whereas if you look in the female inflorescence, each flower is a green ovary topped by a little white stigma. So if the fungus gnat is bringing pollen from a male plant into a female plant and dusting it on these stigmas, that will allow the female plant to produce fruits from these ovaries. It will pollinate the female plant. And those fruits will end up in a compound inflorescence like this, which, like the mayapple, will often topple over because of its weight. And it's hypothesized that the original dispersal agents of these red fruits were probably some ground-feeding bird, because birds are known to be dispersal agents for many of our red fruits. But evidently that bird no longer exists. It must have become extinct at some point along the long evolutionary history of the bird and plant interaction. But these plants still get themselves around. Sometimes these fruits will fall off separately. Each fruit contains either 1 or 2 seeds. Here I've squeezed open a couple of them. I've been told that you shouldn't do this because the fruit pulp contains calcium oxalate crystals, which can burn your hand, but I haven't found that to be true. So these are hard, round seeds. And guess who disperses them? We're back to our box turtle that feeds on these fruits, and again, will travel long distances with them. They've done studies with both mayapple seeds and with jack in the pulpit seeds, and found that those that have traveled some distance with the seeds before excreting them the seeds have a twice as high germination rate as the seeds that are just left to lie where they fall. So something about going through that turtle's gut has taken off the pulp and allowed those seeds to germinate more readily. I do find one other creature feeding on the fruit. I just found this fairly recently. These are blister beetles, which you've probably been told you should never handle, and they do secrete a very caustic substance from their rear ends that can leave a very burning sensation on your hand or wrist. And the female is avidly feeding on these fruits, taking the pulp off. The calcium oxalate crystals don't seem to bother her. It's not the same burning compound that the beetles excrete. And this male, I think, has other ideas in mind. It's not feeding on the fruit, but it knows where to find the females. So I really want to save some time to talk about photography, which I was asked to do. So I'll just show you a few of the other plants that are included in the book, all in great detail. Trillium is one of them, the different types of trillium. Fringe polygala, one of my favorites.
Can you hear me, Carol?
Yes, I can.
Good. This has been absolutely fabulous, and especially the photographs as well as your teaching. But I'm going to ask that maybe we not add too much after this.
Okay.
If you can go through it quickly, that'd be great, because we did save some reports from our members.
Okay.
But Barrett Bookstore, I think we'll probably have a slide about this. Barrett Bookstore, our local independent bookshop, is promoting your books, the spring and the summer wildflower ones.
Oh, that's wonderful. Terrific. And I like supporting local bookstores.
Yes, thank you. It goes both ways, a win-win. And I think that way people can enjoy that much more of what you're saying and showing us.
Okay, so I'll just go quickly to show the images here without naming them.
Great.
Some are common, others are a little more unusual, but they're all native spring wildflowers with the exception of one. So I'm just urging people to take a closer look and to observe not just the flower. Don't plant it just for its beauty, but plant it because it's important to the ecosystem that has co-evolved with it. And just a look at some of my photography equipment. I use single lens reflex, a ring flash, which allows me to get good depth of field if I'm close to a flower. Tripod is important. Most of this is carried in a vest, which I find you can find more easily and less expensively at sporting goods stores and photography stores, and a pack to carry other things. And showing how I use these things. Boots are sometimes necessary, often essential if you're photographing in wet areas, sometimes even waders. I always bring an umbrella because although it may not rain, you may need to block the sun. If you have contrasting light and dark, you're not going to get a good picture, and this sort of evens out the light. And it's even better if you bring somebody to hold the umbrella for you. As I mentioned, the tripod's especially important in dark areas, which this ginseng was growing in. But you have to be adaptable so that here, I'm not dressed in my usual photographer's garb, but we were on our way from a wedding to the venue for the reception. And I noticed this teasel growing along the side of the road. I said, stop the car. And I jumped out and grabbed some pictures of the teasel flowers and the teasel leaves on our way. You have to be fearless of the wild animals that may find you interesting. Here I was surprised by this cow. I knew it was there, but I wasn't looking at it. So it gave me a little nudge that caught my attention. And here, although you may not be able to tell, I'm about 30 feet above the Hudson River here, looking down on partridge berry flowers that I needed to photograph. So the important thing is always to carry your camera with you and to find a way to get to where you need to go, whether it's on a four-wheel vehicle that takes you way into the woods by some friendly landowner. And one thing I didn't mention was that you'll notice a lot of those shots are belly shots. You have to get down low at the level with the flower to get a good view of the flower, much like photographing your children or grandchildren or pets. So with that, I'll leave you with a reminder that Valentine's Day is a good time to give flowers, and especially flowers that will last longer than a week in a vase, or give both, and then you'll really be in somebody's good graces.
And that's great, Carol. I know those books are absolutely beautiful and chock full of photographs. And we obviously know what a great photographer you are now. And I understand the summer one just came out. Is that right? This past?
Well, it's been out since the spring.
Yeah.
And it's a larger book. It covers more species and has over 700 photographs. So it's quite detailed.
That is great. Well, I'm dying to know, where do you live? You're talking about your lake.
I live in South Salem.
South Salem.
And there's an area with 3 lakes that connect to each other. So it's great for canoeing and
yeah, great.
Not too far from Darien.
Great. Well, thank you. Congratulations on getting through the Zoom with us. And
yes,
I can't thank you enough. It's been wonderful. You're a wonderful teacher. I can see how well you must have done in the children's education department at the garden, and never mind what a great photographer you are.
It was a challenge to get kids focused on plants when an animal ran across the path, but we managed to do it.
Yeah, and I bet you miss traveling. All right.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank
Carol.
you, Carol. Your photographs really.
Yeah, Carol, that was wonderful. So one last thing, if you could now stop share your screen, would be great. So we can continue.
Thank you, Carol.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was so beautiful.
Thank you.
Learned so much. Wow.
Most people plant flowers because they're beautiful, but there's more behind that pretty face. They're interesting as well and important, ecologically speaking.
Carol said she will stay on to see our upcoming winter sky photography exhibition.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
So we'll switch over to that, and love to ask Amy and Betsy to introduce this great exhibition. I think you're all going to really enjoy.
Thanks for that great talk on spring flowers. Thank you so much. Betsy and I are thrilled to share the uniquely wonderful winter sky black and white photographs. Please try to notice the simplicity, beauty, and natural luminance of each. Some seasoned photographers feel strongly about the pros of black and white photography. And some of those pros are black and white is more artistic, It is an art. Black and white has more soul, emotion, and atmosphere. With the removal of color, you reveal the essence of things, the luminance. One looks at color photograph, but one looks into black and white photos. So with that, I would like to first thank the 8 entrants besides Betsy and myself. We really appreciate the time you took to take your pictures, and here they are.
Sorry, guys. Hang on, my computer's going crazy.
No worries, we're gonna see it.
On.
Let's take our off.
That's beautiful.
Try to go slowly, please.
Oh, thank you, Amy. Betsy, in putting forth Winter Sky, I think you really inspired our membership, and those photos just do your title justice. So really, having done this before, you guys, that was a great title, and the black and white was terrific. So thank you so much.
Beautiful.
Really, really nice.
Welcome.
Congratulations.
And now we'd like to thank Karen Briganti, Leslie Pennington, and Susan Delp for creating this evening's Floral Design Minute. And Leslie and Susan, take it away.
Hi, everyone. So Susan, Karen, and I have put together a Floral Design Minute on the topic of form. Next slide, please. So form is the outline or three-dimensional shape of flowers, arrangements, or containers. Forms of flowers and containers can be symmetrical or asymmetrical, and there are hundreds of shapes to choose from. Depending upon volume and spacing of materials, floral arrangements can have open or closed forms. A closed form is dense floral materials, defined outline, little negative space, and full and compact design. Next, open form is light, airy, with lots of negative spaces, which implies form or shape. There are also forms within forms. The shapes of flowers and foliage can be grouped into 3 general categories: line, mass, and fillers.
So the line, can everyone hear me okay? So the line are tall, thin, spiky, or twisted materials that create the framework or form linear dominance. Container choice complements these dramatic designs. Mass, typically round and full materials, many have only a single flower to each stem. They can be used as anchors of many designs, providing volume and filling up spaces. Fillers, small flowers, leaves, buds, berries, or seed pods that fill open spaces and connect flower placements, resulting in unity and continuity. Types of form and floral arrangements themselves. We've got all kinds of different shapes to play around with. Some of these are a little more dated looking, but some of them are interesting. And you can see all the different types: S-curves, horizontal L's and triangles and tiered looks. The eye travels directionally following the dramatic forms of these designs. So we want you to remember to make form an exclamation point in your designing. Use creativity when choosing flowers, materials, and containers. And those are the photo credits we used. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you. We're so glad you put the photo credits up. There were some terrific ones in there, and that was a beautiful, beautiful presentation too.
Thank you.
Thank you guys very much. Well, that concludes our evening meeting for 2021 schedule. Thank you all so much. And I can't believe I'm saying, but we'll see you in February. It's coming up.
Thank you. Good night.
Enjoy, everyone. Stay healthy and safe.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation tonight.
Thank you.
It was great.
Thank
It was a
you,
great
Carol.
meeting. Bye.
Great.
Night.
Bye, bye.
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 Thank you.
Hi, Ginger.
Hello.
Thank you.